Okay, hello everybody and welcome to the panel on being on call. I'm sorry, I don't actually have a title slide for this, but this is what we're doing for the next 40 minutes. So I'm Nolan, I work at Google and I'm going to chair this panel. We have 5 very lovely people here, which I'm going to get them to introduce themselves. We have Andrea Spadaccini from Google, we've got Conor McDermottroe from CircleCI, we've got Joy Scharmen from Heroku, we've got Jake Welch from Microsoft, and Theo Schlossnagle from SREcon16. So we have a great cross-section of different industries and different sizes of organizations. So hoping that we can get a really good set of perspectives on what it is that on-call means to a very diverse set of SREs with very different experiences. So can I get you guys all, starting with Joy, to just briefly introduce yourselves for like a few seconds?
Hi, I'm Joy Scharmen. I'm the SRE director at Heroku. I came in and developed the SRE team there about 2.5 years ago, and it's been very interesting and a lot of fun.
Hi, I'm Conor McDermottroe. I work for CircleCI. I kind of float between doing dev stuff, ops stuff, and everything. We're a small company, so we're still kind of in the phase of everybody doing a bit of everything. But yeah, I've been on call a whole bunch of times, so I figure try and share some of the experiences anyway.
Hi everyone, my name is Andrea, and I joined Google. There's a button I call this one. Hi. So yes, my name is Andrea, and I work in Google. I'm the manager for some of the ads SRE teams here in Dublin. Joined the company about 4.5 years ago, and I've been on call for these systems. If you saw Graham's slides, like there was a blue box log processing. That's one of the things that we care about in our teams.
I'm also going to interject that Andrea wrote a very good chapter on being on call for the SRE book that some of you have seen.
Cool. My name is Jake Welch. I work on the Azure team at Microsoft. Been on call for probably about 10 years now. Right now I'm on call for what we call the Senior Incident Manager rotation at Microsoft, which is kind of the big, hairy, nasty outages that happen across multiple services.
I'm Theo Schlossnagle. About 20 years ago, I founded a company that served as on-call for a lot of the largest growing companies in the world. So spent about 14 of those years on call. And now I run a monitoring company that I wake up other people on call.
Thank you all so much. So I think one of the things that we see about SRE is it's still very much emerging as a profession and as an identity. And there's a whole load of questions about what exactly it means to be SRE. So I think a lot of organizations see SRE as going, yay, here are some smart people who'll hold a pager for us. And, on-call is seen very differently from perspectives of different SRE teams in different organizations, and also from the perspective of development teams and traditional ops teams. So what I would like to ask you guys as the first question is, have you ever had disagreements in your organization about what the duties and responsibilities of an on-call are? So if you have had those kind of disagreements, could you talk a bit about those, what they were and how they were resolved? First. Yeah, left to right seems good. Thank you.
Hi, so Heroku, when I came in, had a really sort of interesting on-call arrangement because every team is on call already for their own services. We call it the total ownership model. So what is the SRE on call for? And what we realized is that we were on call for the on-calls. We have the incident commander rotation, which means that we don't necessarily have deep knowledge of each system, but we have to have broad knowledge of how all the systems fit together and know who to tag and when. So that was really interesting coming in, trying to figure out what our on-call should be. Some people thought we should certainly just start taking their pager. Some people didn't understand why we existed at all. And some people were very hesitant about us even running our own services because they didn't want us on call for anything but IC. But this pattern has worked out quite well for us.
Yeah, I think at CircleCI we've kind of been evolving how we do SRE pretty much continuously since I've been at it, because as a company we're growing, so every couple of months the landscape has changed, so we need to redefine what SRE means continuously, which can be a bit of a struggle. So within that, you have disagreements as to, you know, how much is reasonable for the person on call to do versus just raising their hand and saying, hey, I didn't write this system, I need to call somebody who deeply understands what's going on here. But I think really the disagreements along those levels are more resolved by trying to understand that everyone is on the same team. Realistically, we're still a small enough company that everyone has that sense of shared ownership, and I think keeping that is going to be the struggle for us going forward.
So in terms of engagement of SRE, I mean, Google is a big company. We have maybe thousands of services, user-facing and not user-facing. So SREs typically are responsible for the most critical services, like the user-facing ones like search, ads, Gmail, and so on. And our responsibility there is to be the first line when something page-worthy or that can damage, you know, the performance of the service or revenue and so on happens. So the product dev organization and the SRE organization are in continuous communication about whether SREs should or should not be involved in a given product. Duties are for duties, the page-worthy incidents typically arrive to SRE first, and then we may escalate to developers. Non-critical alerts, that's more of a gray area. We can decide whether to handle them or not. One interesting point that I have seen in Google, I mean, I don't have experience about other organizations, but in Google, SREs are not just the people that are on call for this thing, like you throw the product over the wall and then we take care of that and take the pages and so on. One interesting thing that can happen is that we can give back a service to developers. So if the operational load is unsustainable and so on, and if we think it doesn't really meet our standards of sustainability and whether we can effectively do our job, taking care of production, we can hand the pager back. So similarly as when you onboard a service, you can also offboard a service. And this tension typically results in better products because developers want to develop something that can be taken care of by SREs, and happier SREs because the stress levels are lower and we can generally be more useful for the company, I would say.
So at Microsoft, we started using a model that's really similar to the US FEMA disaster response process 8 or 10 years ago. I think that's a pretty common model across a lot of teams. That gives us some pretty good breakdown of what the roles are. There's been some disagreement in terms of who exactly might execute against those roles or when they would change based off of the scope of the incident and how those things happen. But overall, that model's actually worked really well for us in terms of giving really clear roles and then mapping those against people. In terms of the engagement for SRE, we're not broadly at a point where SRE is really taking the pager on, and so there's been certainly some conversations where teams want that and desire the pager to be taken from them and think that SRE is there to take the pager. We're not broadly there for most of the services that we're engaged with at this point, and so that's been kind of a continuing conversation that we need to have.
So I have an interesting answer that it was always exactly what I said it was because I was the boss. So the definition of SRE was exactly what it was. But in the kind of unique position of dealing with thousands of different clients, intimately knowing about 100 of them, to see all the different casualties of operations management in each company, and they each have a unique mythology of failure. But the interesting part is that each one brings with it a culture that, if abruptly changed, would cause the group to collapse. So when you look at manipulating an organization to become more optimal in the whole resiliency and reliance model, right? I mean, what we're here to do is to engineer things so that the consequence of failure is less. I mean, that's kind of the end all, because it's always going to break and it's always going to be under-delivering. So just minimizing that consequence. The interesting part of that culture that has to change is the get off my lawn part and the kind of welcoming of outside influence, right? So I've sat down with so many teams and had the conversation of like, are you an idiot? And they're like, no. And I was like, okay, because your company hired you and you're not an idiot, so your company doesn't hire idiots. So your colleague that's on another team, likely not an idiot either. right? So when they give you input about your service or about the design of something, just because they're not a DBA or not a software developer, doesn't mean they don't have probably incredibly valuable insight that you should internalize. So that whole breaking down the fences and not yelling at people to get off your lawn was the single thing that all of the organizations were lacking that added the most amount of value. So that cultural shift, they all still look like their own little tornadoes and hurricanes, but that was the convergent aspect.
Thanks. That's really interesting. I'm kind of seeing kind of three divisions here. So there's you, who's off on your own little thing, Theo, and then we have the sort of the Heroku and the the Heroku and the Microsoft approach are very much SRE are sort of the incident managers, but not on call for specific services. Whereas the Google and interestingly, your approach are kind of more akin to, the SRE should try and have more responsibility for a given service and try and, have a more in-depth response. So that's an interesting sort of dichotomy that we see there. So the next question that I was going to ask you guys is, being on call for services or being the root level incident responders, in what way do you think that this informs the rest of your work as SREs?
Well, I think that the general awareness of the operability of systems, it ends up being implicitly the first thing that's on your list of everything. So every piece of, you even take it home, like when you cook dinner, you're like, how's this going to get cleaned up? Like what sort of mess is this going to cause? Is it going to be on time? So just the aspects of delivery bump to the number one item on all the evaluation processes. And they tend to, that sort of reordering of priorities tends to creep out of the technology world as well.
Yeah, and I think adding to that, I think our main thing is you gain so much insight about the service, how things function, how things run, and how they break, more importantly, I think, that you can go and take back to your day job, how you prioritize, what types of things that you might implement. If this thing broke over here this way, then maybe we should go look at the system over here that also might be affected in the same way. And so those learnings are super valuable, and it's actually, I think somebody else said in another talk, it's free training. And I think that's actually a really good way to look at it, that it's something that's really valuable as growing as individuals, but also as organizations that you can take advantage of if you know how to do that and get the right data around it.
So I'd say I fully agree with what you just said about knowledge of production, what breaks, actually informing our work. And actually what our work is essentially, we can work on several levels with the product development teams and within our own organization. And being consultants, like in the design phase, where the architecture is shaped, you can actually have your voice if you've seen the production system scramble multiple times under a certain pattern that maybe is not evident to people that are not always there when things break. And also, the on-call part of our work essentially makes us way more exposed to the repetitive part of operating any given system in production, that we actually can find more easily areas where automation or other types of innovation would make everything just more efficient and allow us to work better, even either with developers or among ourselves as we develop like SRE platforms for automation and other stuff.
Yeah, I think at Circle CI, one of the things we tend to do is people are on call for relatively short periods of their day, and the rest of their day they're spending doing engineering work, whether it's product engineering, which is generally what I end up doing, or the people who are more ops focused tend to spend their time improving the tooling, improving the monitoring. That's a never-ending job, as you all know. So because of that, the time you spend on call, you know what's currently broken, you know what's currently working well that you don't really need to work on right now, and it gives you a better sense of priorities within the organization that you can then feed back into your product development cycle, which I find is very useful to keep as many of the engineers as close to that day-to-day running as possible, because they just pick better things to work on.
Yeah, I completely agree, especially about getting things into the product development cycle. Or just in the engineering development cycle, every quarter we do sort of an overall big planning operation, and it's incredibly valuable to me to see everything that's on the planning board, be able to add my own things, and be able to throw in my hat when I say, you know what, that thing is the thing that we've had like the most incidents on lately, so we need to prioritize that. It's really, really important. And in general, yeah, just the sense of leverage that you know where to push if you are taking a step back and looking at the entire structure, whereas someone who is just within a team is going to see that only within their own system.
Thank you guys. It's a really, really good set of answers. So what I'm hearing is, first off, we become experts on the patterns of how systems fail. We see something that may have happened on a system we worked on a couple of years ago, and we see something similar now, and we can very much head problems off at the pass. We prioritize reliability because we see the consequences. We see opportunities for automation, for improving the monitoring, and for improving the system itself. So yeah, thank you guys, that's really good. The next question that I would like to ask is, how do you guys tackle the problem of getting newer engineers ready to go on call? And this is a problem close to my heart at the moment because I changed teams a couple of months ago and I'm going through this right now with a really complicated system, so tell me your secrets.
So I used to work in Yahoo Mail operations, and I was terrified to take that pager, completely freaked out. And what really helped me at the time was one of my coworkers, Terrence, looking at me and saying, the first time I went on call, I got my first page, I looked at it, I went to my boss and said, I have no idea what this is. And I realized that the things you get paged on as an engineer aren't usually the things that you were necessarily thinking of outside of pages. So what I think has really, really helped me and getting people going for my team has been very much like a shadow ride-along sort of process, where you get to really see and experience what it's like to be in the rotation without any pressure to feel that you have to solve the problem. And then in the long run, making it absolutely clear that you should call in for help. If you don't know what you're doing and you're freaking out, you call help. We'll help you fix it, and then you can learn more about that when things are not on fire.
Yeah, I think our experience is pretty much identical to that. Like, we start off, anybody who's new, they start off pairing while they're on the pager. They don't get it and then just get told, all right, off you go, have fun, hope you don't break anything. But yeah, apart from that, yeah, encouraging people to call for help. Also encouraging the more experienced people to kind of keep an eye on the new people and say, hey, look, yeah, you might have been a little slow to work on this, but have you noticed we also have this other tool over here, we have these other sources of information over here, being proactive about getting people up to speed, and doing it as kindly as possible, because people are scared when they're in a new job, and if they've just got a pager and they've just got a whole bunch of pages because they happen to join at a bad time, that's terrifying. So trying to kind of remember that they're probably scared, they're probably worried, oh God, I'm going to get fired for taking the whole thing down. Trying to ease that pain is a big part of the onboarding process.
Yeah, again, I fully agree. Like, feeling safe is one of the main steps in the road of being on call. So the way we bring new Googlers, new SREs on board on call in the teams I've worked with is the following. We first have generic SRE training. So we have a thing called SRE EDU, which is essentially the way we disseminate the core pieces of information that you need to work with production and with in Google and with on-call protocols in Google, like escalation, incident management, and so on. And then you typically have some sort of team-specific training where your dashboards or your playbooks are explained by a teammate, and of course, again, you have the shadowing process. We also have a thing called reverse shadowing, where the new on-caller is actually on call, gets the pages, but then again, the experienced engineer is responsible for the final resolution or whatever, or escalation. Yes, feeling safe is definitely a fundamental thing. The other part of safety, I think, is knowing that there is always someone to escalate to, not just, as you said, but not just in your immediate team. Because, for example, the teams I work with are on call in Europe from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And if I'm paged at 6:30, I will not have someone belonging to my immediate team available for help, we always know that we can escalate to developers. So people that have the main authors of the software are actually on call 24/7 in case something really breaks. And as you mentioned earlier, in doubt, escalate. Like, these are the 3 words that I always use when someone is about to go on call. Just don't worry, in doubt, escalate. If you are not sure if this is production impacting or if it's threatening RSLO, or if you should wake up someone at 3 a.m. in California, do it. Like, no one will blame you really, and you will get adjusted pretty quickly.
Yeah, so we do pretty similar stuff. We actually have a concept of an onboarding buddy for most of the teams that are responsible for getting that person up to speed. Obviously, we have videos and documentation and other things for given services to try to get people up on exactly how the service itself works. And then we also have the shadow, where the new person is shadowing somebody who's more experienced in actually performing, running outages, or doing kind of the day-to-day activities. And then the reverse shadow, where that person's always engaged with them. So that during their time when they're actually on call, there's actually a person there. It's not, call them if you need them. It's they are there in order to help you if you need help at that point in time. The last thing is we do similarly. It's really important to have that kind of get out of jail free card for an issue that you don't know. And I think that applies for both kind of more senior people who have done it for a long time, as well as for more junior people. Usually for somebody who's more junior, it's going to take obviously significantly more time to shadow and kind of get up to speed than somebody who's done this before. And so we do kind of adjust based off of those situations. But generally it's make them feel as comfortable as possible, make sure they have all the resources that they need to be successful in their job, and train from there. On-the-job experience is always much more valuable than the simulated or even the documentation or other things. So it's really important to get that shadow time.
My answer is going to sound a lot like everybody else's. But I think that, so in our organization, everyone is on call. Not on call. Everyone is always available to be woken up when least convenient to solve a problem. And everyone knows that. And during the hiring process, if you are in any operations-related field where you're responsible for production things, we try to gauge some sort of level of excitement for solving problems that you caused. And when people are excited about that, they tend to be a little bit less intimidated. And for everybody else, we try to make sure that the gauge isn't like below 5, right? So, on a scale from 1 to 10, you want ops people and SREs and people who really care that production is always working as a primary job to be in the 9-10 range, and everybody else, no one's below 5. Because if someone says, I guess you could wake me up if it's broken, it's like, well, I guess you could search for another job. So once you have everybody in that bracket, though, I think that, everyone's on call. You can always escalate. You can side escalate. We have a lot of people that will call up and say, man, I'm tired. They're senior, and that's not a problem at all. Everybody's kind of on the same team. But they all said? Same thing.
So I'm going to ask a question on that then. Do you find that those people who are always, that know the service really well tend to get more burned out and they are called a lot as a result of that?
Actually, it really depends on the character of the person. I think that people tend to they have a tendency to shoulder the things that they want to. So a lot of people that really know the service well and don't really get excited about being woken up at 2 a.m. every single morning, they tend to have really good playbooks, really good cross education, and the ones that they were up looking at the system at 2 a.m. every day anyway, so they tend to be a little bit less knowledge transferring, and it's a little bit more dangerous for the organization, but I think it's a lot of personal psyche that affects that.
Actually, I think this can be a bit detrimental to the people that I would not like to know I can always be woken up. So at least personally and in the teams I work with, you have these on-call rotations, and if you're not on call, it's very, very unusual that you get woken up. So the side escalations are common during, as you mentioned, but during business hours. So if I'm paged and I have the TL here, the tech lead for the team, then I might just go there and say, look, I have no clue what's going on here. But if it's 6 a.m., I will not wake up the tech lead of the SRE team that's sleeping. I will wake up the developer who's on call and who's actually supposed to be woken up at the time.
We tend to prefer waking up the developer before the other members of the SRE team. So once you've identified, I mean, that's what an SRE really needs to be good at, is identifying who the stakeholders capable of solving a problem are. And then once you get into the product realm, you're kind of in the product realm, even though there are no fences and no lawns. Might as well just keep it there.
Cool. So thank you very much. That was a good discussion. So we have a lot of consensus around that. I mean, onboarding-wise, shadowing and reverse shadowing seems to be the way. I mean, it's an apprenticeship. A lot of talk about making sure that new engineers feel safe to be on call, aware that they have help and escalation points if necessary. And then an interesting digression on work-life balance and optimizing for choosing the people who are going to be able to deal with it. Thank you for that. The next question that I want to pose to you guys is, do you and your team actually monitor the operational load of being on call? Do you monitor it short-term, long-term? What do you find that challenging to monitor or easy to monitor? And if it becomes too high or too low, what do you do about it?
We're a monitoring company. We monitor everything.
Of course you do.
You know, if it moves, you track it. So, yeah, I mean, most of that actually directly relates to customer satisfaction almost all the time. So if you're not monitoring, somebody else is, and you're going to get a really awkward report. But I've never seen the load drop so much that structural changes in an organization are required. Mainly because in the ops world, it used to be that way, right? You know, if the load went down, then you could go from a team of 5 to a team of 4 or something like that. But in the SRE world, where your people doing operations are also engineering product enhancements, product reliability and resiliency enhancements, there's not really a shortage of that. That never goes down. There's always a backlog there. So if I think it shifts around. I've never seen head count reduce.
Yeah, so on our side, we track a bunch of different metrics and have the ability to pivot around those things. So it's like the number of calls that somebody receives for a given issue, how many times that they have to call somebody else or call another set of people in order to be able to resolve something. We track something what we call first touch resolution, and that's the ability for that first person who's called to be able to resolve that issue. That's a big one for us, just because it's really important that we're accurate in terms of finding the right person who can actually solve the issue the first time, and not that person has to call somebody who has to call somebody who has to call somebody. We also kind of track the timing, so how long somebody's engaged. So on any of our bridges that we have, it's this person joined at this time and ended at this time, and here's how active they were on that bridge. So we can kind of gauge if we've got 50 people who happen to join a call, are they actually doing something, or are they just sitting there wondering, like asking, what's going on and how everything is functioning. There's kind of a trade-off that we make with that, though, too, where you don't want to put a significant amount of burden on the on-call person to collect information for you, so that you can diagnose it later to be able to understand your on-call stuff better. So you have to make a trade-off between how much burden you put on the on-call person to go and click that box or do that thing in order to be able to get much better information on those things. So as much as possible, we try to remove that from them, because they're already focused on trying to resolve the issue. We don't need them to do more procedural things. And so automating that is super important to be able to get that information.
So of course we keep track, as you mentioned, of operational load metrics, and typically in our teams we review them weekly and for the short term, but it's hard to spot trends there. And we review them on a long term, typically on a quarterly boundary, so you can keep track of how you're doing quarter over quarter. So which metrics to monitor? Of course, number of escalations, type of escalations. These are all interesting, and keeping them low has some value. What I think has more value to keep down is to keep up, is the ratio of pages to SLO misses, or to real problems. And this is a theme that was touched earlier by Bjorn and the talk before Bjorn's talk. So receiving alerts or receiving notifications, or in general having something to do interrupt your flow is costly, and we want to keep these interactions as few as possible of these get to the on-call engineer. So one of the things we track is, for example, the page to outage ratio, where by page I mean something that reaches my pager, and outage I mean like an SLO breach or user visible incident or something that really matters for the team. So it's important to define good SLOs. It's important service level objectives. So how do we measure the performance of the system? It's important to tune how quickly and how often you are alerted for an event that gets your system out of the good zone, let's say.
Yeah, for us, we have essentially two sets of measurements around how we handle operational stuff and SRE stuff. The one set is the standard kind of OKR level stuff for the company, and a lot of them are pretty shared. Like, realistically for us, SRE is a lot about cost control, because we're running a whole bunch of machines. They cost a lot of money. We want to make sure we're spending just enough but not too much. So obviously that's the objective we really care about on that side. But the other side that we really care about is what's the kind of mental state of everybody who is working in the SRE organization, because we want them to, stay in the company for as long as possible and learn and grow and be valuable members. If we burn them out, that's really bad for everybody, because if one person burns out, then it drops on somebody else. So managing the happiness of everybody on call is the number one job for the person in our organization whose job it is to manage operational concerns. So that's his number one job every day, is to make sure that people are getting enough sleep, are not being burnt out, have the tools that they need, have all of the emotional support really from the rest of the organization to be able to do their job and be happy long term.
Yeah, well, we measure too. We definitely reduce we don't have the engineers actually clicking any buttons or anything. We have a lot of tooling in place to measure. Some of this, of course, is really basic. There's right now there's a spreadsheet that I have like categorizations of why we had public incidents. So we have change, flaw, capacity, users, and platform, right? And change and flaw are definitely the highest, right? So one thing that I track is sort of week over week, and I look at it over the sense of like month over month, is, are we having the same types of incidents over and over again? Are certain teams having those incidents? Did this team have 5 incidents last month after a deploy, right? Like, that's really, okay, let's flag that with them. The other sort of aspect is on-call burden. Because all of our teams are essentially, on call, that's where our SRE model eventually will probably break out into a more Google model when we get big enough for it. I kind of watch it per team and just look over time. At a certain level, it doesn't fluctuate meaningfully week over week. Our team that has the most pager volume is our database team, because that's the place with the state. So they have a lot of really awesome automated incident resolvers, plug for my coworkers' talk. But they actually put in a subjective sort of check. It's like, how's your on-call today? It's just like happy, sad, neutral. And I'm really curious, because it's in process, to see what they end up getting from that, because they were worried about burnout.
Another thing that maybe, yeah. Hey. Another thing that's interesting is applying load shedding techniques to the SRE team. So the typical, there's 2 types of stress that happen. One of them is everything is broken, and the other is that one thing is broken again and again and again. And the second one, you can definitely you can do priority inversion on the dev team. So if you have a specific component, and it's almost always due to change, like you said, that becomes fragile, and tends to break rapidly, then you do priority inversion on paging, and the SRE team is no longer on call for that. It's actually the dev team that's on call until they get their shit fixed, and then it flips back. So that's really useful as well.
Yeah, that is. And to build onto that, there's something that we actually try to enforce at Heroku is when we do have long-running or chronic incidents, we try to make sure that the same person isn't being nailed over and over and over again. We really ideally try to do a 4-hour turnover, because if it's, just something you're babysitting a little bit and like a job's running, maybe you don't need that. But if you are seriously focused on solving like a pants to fire emergency, after 4 hours, you're going to really start making mistakes.
If you're working on something for 4 hours, maybe you should just kick in some sort of incident management procedure. So the way we do things like this, especially if they're user-facing or big enough, let's say, and that was mentioned by you, I guess. We have this procedure where we assign roles to people that are on call, and this is actually works. This is pretty scalable because you have a commander role, operations role, communications role, and then planning role. And these things can actually, you can assign roles even to teams, and have a hierarchical structure. So this makes sure that, for example, if I got this page this morning, I spent 3 hours and got nowhere. I paid someone else, ask this person to take care of operation, I take care of incident commander, maybe talk to someone who needs to do communication, and then I'm less stressed. Well, I know it's not just me. I have a team behind me that's fixing the thing.
Yeah, to be clear, that's actually once we're in that process, we've very well trained our engineers to be like, as soon as you think that this is customer impacting, or even if you're just feeling a little bit like, I don't know, you got the wig and something's going wrong, you page IC, right? And then that's one thing that my team does as ICs is kind of try to enforce that, like, keeping an eye on you. Maybe you need a hand. Why don't you call Fred? Yeah, just call Fred. And then, and we do that for ourselves too.
That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, so I guess what we're seeing here is we're seeing a variety of approaches to trying to measure the on-call load, going from customer satisfaction to SLO misses to ratio of pages to SLO misses to subjective things like, are the engineers happy and burning out? We're looking for indicators like everything is broken, everyone is burned out, to one incident is recurring or one thing is broken all the time. Load shedding approaches, handed back to developers, and also, escalation points and delegation for major incidents using something like the incident command system. So I was going to try and have a Q&A at the end, but that last question rather ran over. It is coffee time now for the next 40 minutes. If you guys don't mind, we could take questions for like 2 minutes. Okay, any audience questions about the topic of on-call for our lovely panelists, who have all been amazing? Thank you so much. Any questions? Question here, yes. Oh.
Can you go to the mic?
Yeah. Yeah. Or you can say it loudly and I'll repeat it. So the question is, for our panelists, do you guys tend to get, are you guys the first line of defense, or is there a tier 1 support organization that is delegating to you guys? And do you typically get either, is it mostly automated pages or manual escalations? So if anyone has any interesting answers to that?
Well, I can reply to both very quickly, level 1 versus level 2. I'm not aware of any configuration like this, but I wouldn't be surprised by seeing that, especially in teams like apps, like Google Apps, that are more customer-facing rather than, for example, ads or ads is customer-facing. This ties into the second one. Yes, we do have both automatic and manual pages, mostly automatic ones, but you can just page very easily any on-call rotation by sending one email, and we have a directory of on-call rotation, so you can discover like who do I notify for this type of issues. And this is really Google-wide, not really SRE-wide. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, so we have kind of a combination of different inputs and flows that we have for our stuff. For Azure in particular, it's both kind of an internally facing as well as externally facing service that has customers. So we have both customer support flows that have people, obviously 24/7, 365, helping customers out, and we do have escalations that come through that path. We've got social monitoring and escalation that happens from there. So anything that, like if you go on Twitter, that can be escalated if something happens there. And then we do have both automated and manual pages. We try to get everything to be as automated as possible so we get to the right people and kind of get those things through quickly. Anytime that you have a human involved, there's always latency and delay that is incurred. And so that's not necessarily good. So we try to make sure that we have the automation in place if possible.
So yeah, we don't really have an L1 system unless you count our engineers and our support engineers as that system. Generally, our engineers are getting automated alerts from their systems. It's definitely an anti-pattern and something we flag in retrospectives if we found out about an outage from a customer complaint rather than, a machine. And as far as alerts to the SRE rotation specifically, the vast majority are actually done by engineers who need assistance, and we do get some for our own systems because we maintain monitoring systems.
Yeah, I think on the second part, the automated versus manual, I think we've used the manual procedure a couple of times, but only to catch people who aren't necessarily on call right now, but just use the mechanism to page them so that they get the page in the same way as they have already configured it, because people have different ways of preferring to receive pages. So that's the only reason we ever use the manual one. Everything else is automated. And in terms of the L1 versus everything else, the person on call is L1, the rest of the company is L2. So.
That's great. Thank you all so much. So what I'm going to say is it's time for coffee break now, I believe. So thank you all so much for your kind attention, and thank you again to the panel, and enjoy. If anyone wants to hear more about the incident command system, which was mentioned several times, there's a workshop in 40 minutes over in one of the other rooms. So.